So, um, if you think forcing a polite, professional tone in a tense meeting is somehow saving your reputation, you are almost certainly wrong.
Oh, totally wrong. I mean, it's a huge misconception.
Right, because, well, that forced politeness, like the tight smile or the carefully measured voice while you're just secretly boiling inside, that is basically a psychological ticking time bomb.
It really is. It's exhausting, frankly.
So today we are entirely dismantling that myth, the myth of tone management in the workplace. We're doing a deep dive, skipping all the superficial communication hacks and just going straight to the root.
The architectural root of the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why you lose your cool, why certain colleagues drive you absolutely insane,
Yeah.
and, precisely how to rewire that biological reflex before it ruins your career.
Which is a critical distinction to make right up front. Because relying on tone management is essentially just relying on willpower.
And willpower is finite, right?
Highly finite. In a high-pressure environment, that resource depletes so rapidly. So today, we are pulling from this incredibly dense, actionable blueprint.
Yeah, the excerpt we have is from a framework known as Mastery of the Internal Response.
Right, and we are jumping straight into the deep end here. We're looking at what this framework designates as day 5 of its program.
Day 5, so no beginner stuff here.
No, day 5 is where the training wheels completely come off. It's that transition from, well, merely noticing you are upset to executing deep, real-time emotional regulation.
And our mission for you today, listening to this right now, is to give you the actual operational mechanics of that transition.
Step by step.
Right. We're going to decode the specific technique of the replacement response. We're going to map out the exact neurobiological triggers that hijack your brain in the middle of a workday.
Which happens to all of us, by the way.
Oh, constantly. We're also going to build out a mental worksheet for your daily trigger tracking, designing a real 7-day schedule to master these skills.
And maybe most importantly, we are going to look at the exact word-for-word scripts you need to adopt.
Yeah, the scripts to project calm, assertive authority when every instinct you have is just screaming at you to fight back.
So the overarching philosophy that anchors this entire day 5 protocol is explicitly stated in the text. It says, manage your triggers, not just your tone.
Manage your triggers, not just your tone. Wow.
Yeah. The framework introduces this concept of your growth edge. And your growth edge isn't about, learning a new software or leading a better stand-up meeting.
Right. It's not an external skill.
Exactly. It defines the growth edge strictly as your ability to notice what activates you before it controls you.
Before it controls you. Let's really dig into that separation of tone and triggers.
Yeah.
Because my natural instinct, and likely the instinct of anyone listening who prides themselves on being a seasoned professional, is to obsess over the external performance.
Oh, sure. The mask.
Right, the mask.
Yeah.
If I am frustrated because a project is off the rails, I put immense effort into masking it. I lower my pitch. I use, collaborative buzzwords.
Which takes so much energy.
So much energy. But trying to fix a tense dynamic by just slapping a polite tone over it. I mean, the analogy that comes to mind is it's exactly like putting a fresh, expensive coat of paint over a massive water leak in your ceiling.
Yes, that is the perfect mechanical equivalent.
Right, because you step back, you admire the smooth drywall, and you think, okay, problem solved, nobody can see the damage.
But the water is still actively leaking behind that drywall.
Exactly. The internal pressure is accumulating drop by drop, and eventually that water is going to saturate the barrier, burst through, and absolutely destroy your new paint job anyway.
It's inevitable, and the framework we are studying today is basically grabbing us by the shoulders and saying, stop painting the ceiling and go find the busted pipe.
Find the busted pipe. I love that. So how do we actually locate it?
Well, to locate that busted pipe, we have to slow down the microscopic timeline of a human reaction. Because usually we experience a reaction as a single instantaneous event.
Like someone says something condescending and we immediately snap back.
Boom, one event. But neurologically, that is not what is happening at all. The framework breaks it down into a chronological sequence.
Okay, walk me through the sequence.
First, there is the activation. That is the external stimulus hitting your nervous system, like the initial drop of water from the busted pipe.
Right, the trigger being pulled.
Then there is a space. It is minuscule, but it is there. Finally, if that activation goes unnoticed in that space, it inevitably leads to control.
The activation just takes the wheel.
Exactly. When the text demands that we notice what activates you before it controls you, it is telling us that human evolution, like the place where you actually mature and change your behavioral destiny lives, lives entirely inside that micro gap.
that micro gap between the stimulus and the hijacking. And that gap is measured in what, milliseconds?
Milliseconds, a
Oh.
fraction of a heartbeat.
Wow.
Yeah. When you are asked to notice in that gap, you are essentially being asked to cultivate a dual consciousness.
What do you mean by dual consciousness?
You have to be the person experiencing the hot flash of frustration while simultaneously being the analytical observer watching the frustration arrive on your internal dashboard.
Oh, that sounds incredibly difficult.
It is, because if you miss that micro gap, biology wins. The amygdala, which is the alarm bell of your brain, just floods your system with cortisol and adrenaline.
Right, the fight or flight response.
Literally. It reroutes blood flow away from your prefrontal cortex, which is the logical, rational, highly paid part of your brain. And suddenly, you are operating on primitive survival instincts.
You are being controlled.
Totally controlled.
So for everyone listening, think about that reality for a second.
Yeah.
Think about a moment, maybe just yesterday, where you felt completely controlled by an interaction.
Yeah, like a late email or something.
Right. A client sends a passive-aggressive, highly critical email at, 4:55 p.m. on a Friday. You don't consciously choose to be furious.
Yeah, fury just bypasses your consent.
Exactly. It bypasses your consent and takes over your central nervous system. So, to understand why that specific email breaches your defenses, we have to confront what is arguably the most uncomfortable revelation in this entire text.
Oh, it is a bitter pill to swallow.
Lay it on us.
The text posits this. You do not react only because of the moment. You react because the moment touches something in you.
Okay, I have to push back on this, or at least play the skeptic for a minute,
Go for it.
because this borders on a very dangerous kind of, corporate gaslighting.
Yeah.
If Boggs sends an objectively terrible, insulting, and factually incorrect email, my reaction is a direct result of Bob's incompetence.
It feels like it's the moment's fault.
Right. It is the moment's fault. If I start telling myself, oh, this is just touching an internal vulnerability of mine, doesn't that just let Bob completely off the hook?
I hear that all the time.
Yeah, like, how do we practice this without becoming a corporate doormat who just excuses everyone else's toxic behavior?
That is the crucial trap people fall into when they first encounter emotional regulation work. They confuse internal regulation with external absolution.
External absolution, meaning forgiving Bob.
Right. Acknowledging what the moment touches inside you does not excuse Bob's behavior. Bob might very well be objectively incompetent.
He usually is.
Right, and his email might be deeply unprofessional. But Bob's incompetence is external data. Your reaction, the spiking heart rate, the urge to draft a blistering reply that CCs his manager.
The ruined Friday night where you vent to your partner for 2 hours.
Yes. All of that is entirely your liability.
So it's about untangling the external problem from my internal suffering.
Precisely. By acknowledging what the trigger touches inside you, you are decoupling your nervous system from Bob's actions.
Oh, I see. I can still hold Bob accountable.
You absolutely can still reject his premise, but you do it from a place of cold, executive control rather than limbic panic.
You aren't letting Bob off the hook. You are taking Bob off your emotional control panel.
That is exactly it. And to do that, the framework doesn't just leave us with a vague concept of internal feelings. It gets very specific.
Yeah, it categorizes our vulnerabilities into 5 highly specific, deep-rooted triggers. Let's list them. Unfairness, incompetence, wasted time, disrespect, and lack of ownership.
5 major architectural roots.
Let's dissect each of these systematically, because if you're listening to this, I guarantee you have a primary residence in at least 1 or 2 of these categories.
Oh, without a doubt.
Let's start with the heavy hitters, unfairness and disrespect. When someone hits these buttons, why does it feel so incredibly personal?
Because it's a direct assault on your evolutionary survival strategy.
How so?
Well, humans are hypersocial creatures, right? Our survival in a tribe depended entirely on our status and the equity of our relationships.
So unfairness triggers a tribal panic.
Exactly. It violates our deep-seated need for reciprocal justice. Let's look at a classic workplace role-play scenario to really illustrate this.
Let's hear it.
Okay. You have been grinding on a vital project for 6 months. You've sacrificed weekends. A colleague, let's call him David.
Typical David.
Right. David, who contributed perhaps 5% of the actual labor, presents the final deck to the executive steering committee.
I can feel my blood pressure rising already.
Just wait. During the presentation, David repeatedly uses the word I instead of we. He says, I found this data. I developed this strategy.
Yeah, the activation is immediate and visceral.
But look at the mechanics of the moment. The moment is literally just a pronoun change in a conference room. It's a single syllable.
I instead of we.
Right. But what it touches in you is the primal root of unfairness. Your brain interprets David taking credit not just as an annoyance, but as a literal threat to your standing in the tribe.
It's a threat to my future resources, my professional survival.
Exactly. And disrespect operates on that exact same frequency.
Right, like if a senior partner talks over you in a meeting or, waves away your idea without letting you finish the sentence.
The annoyance isn't about the interruption itself, it's the signal the interruption sends.
It activates the root of disrespect.
Yeah.
Because your core human need to be valued, to be seen as a contributing member of the hierarchy, has been publicly dismissed.
Yes. And that angry reaction, the snapping back, or conversely, the sudden icy withdrawal from the conversation, is simply your biological defense mechanism trying to protect that vulnerable root.
Okay, that makes total sense. So let's pivot to incompetence and lack of ownership. These feel related to disrespect, but the underlying psychological threat is completely different, isn't it?
They are drastically different. Disrespect is a threat to my status, but incompetence feels like a threat to my physical energy.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it.
Yeah, incompetence and lack of ownership threaten our reliance on the system. They directly increase our own burden.
Going back to evolutionary psychology again.
Always. If someone in your hunting party drops their spear, the entire tribe is now vulnerable to the predator. That primitive software is still running in your brain.
So when a team member consistently makes careless errors on a financial report,
It isn't an abstract annoyance. Your brain registers a structural failure. It signals, the system is unsafe, this person cannot carry their weight.
which means I am going to have to expend my own finite, precious energy to fix their mess so we don't all fail.
Precisely. It's the sheer exhaustion of it.
It is like being forced to run a three-legged race with a partner who stubbornly refuses to tie their shoes and then looks at you confused when you both fall over.
That is a great analogy. And lack of ownership is the behavioral cousin of incompetence. It is the deeply toxic, not my job mentality.
Oh, man. Imagine an email chain where a critical client request has been dropped. Instead of solving it, a team member replies all with, I wasn't aware I was the primary on this. I thought marketing was handling it.
The defensive deflection, it is infuriating.
Because they aren't just defending themselves, right?
No, they are taking their share of the collective weight and actively dropping it onto your shoulders. They're demanding that you absorb the impact of their negligence.
That triggers an immediate primal resentment.
It really does. Which brings us to the fifth and final root. Wasted time.
Time is the ultimate finite resource. You can acquire more money, you can rebuild status, but time is a straight, depreciating line.
Exactly. When someone wastes your time, when they schedule a mandatory hour-long meeting with no agenda,
Or force you to sit through a PowerPoint reading of information you received in an email 3 days ago.
yes, it isn't just inefficient. Psychologically, it is a form of theft.
It threatens your autonomy.
It touches the part of you that feels trapped, powerless, and disrespected because they are signaling that their convenience is worth more than your mortality.
Wow, okay. This categorization is brilliant. By taking the infinite, chaotic variety of irritating workplace dynamics and boiling them down to these 5 specific roots, this framework is basically handing us a superpower.
It allows for total depersonalization.
Yes. You aren't fighting Bob's late email. Bob is irrelevant. Your internal dashboard is simply lit up because the lack of ownership trigger was pressed.
It shifts the entire narrative from this person is attacking me to my internal machinery requires regulation.
Depersonalization is the skeleton key to emotional intelligence. When you make the conflict about the mechanical trigger rather than the offending person, you instantly drain the emotional venom out of the interaction.
You move from subjective drama to objective data collection.
And that transition from drama to data leads us directly into the primary awareness exercise of day 5.
Mhm.
The framework actually demands immediate action here, right? We aren't just philosophizing about tribal dynamics.
No, it gives us a daily trigger tracking directive. It says, today, identify your top 3 triggers. And it provides a very specific mental worksheet, a formula to fill out.
Right. The formula is, when I feel triggered by blank, I tend to blank.
It is a brilliantly simple yet deceptively brutal structure.
So my first question on the mechanics of this.
Okay.
Why limit it to the top 3? If all 5 of these roots live inside us to some degree, why artificially restrict our focus?
You limit it to 3 for the sake of cognitive load. Behavioral change requires immense bandwidth.
Makes sense.
If you attempt to monitor every single microaggression across all 5 categories simultaneously, you will experience decision fatigue by 10:0 a.m.
You just burn out.
You have to triage. You identify the top 3 triggers that cause the highest collateral damage in your specific professional environment.
Okay, but regarding the second half of that worksheet, why is confronting that second blank, the I tend to part, so incredibly uncomfortable?
Because it gets to the absolute core of why most people fail at self-improvement. It forces you to stop looking at the leak and look at your own messy, destructive attempts to fix it.
Right. Filling in the first blank, identifying the trigger, is relatively easy. It just requires basic observational skills.
When I feel triggered by people jumping to conclusions, you are just noting a pattern in your environment.
But filling in that second blank, I tend to become sharp and over-explain. That requires rigorous, often painful self-awareness.
It forces you to drop the narrative that you are just a victim of circumstance. You have to admit to your own default, highly unhelpful coping mechanisms.
It's the admission of guilt. It's admitting that when the pressure builds, my default tendency isn't to fix the pipe, it's to grab a sledgehammer and start smashing the drywall.
Exactly.
I will happily offer myself up as a vulnerable example here. When my wasted time trigger is hit, say, someone is asking questions in a meeting that were clearly answered in the brief they didn't read, I tend to go highly passive-aggressive.
Oh, how so?
I will literally pull up the document, share my screen, and say, as per my previous email on page 2, which everyone in the corporate world knows is just sanitized language for, can you not read?
Yes, the weaponized screen share.
My tendency is to publicly shame them under the guise of being helpful. It's awful.
But that honesty is exactly what the framework demands. We all have those toxic tendencies. Some people withdraw completely and let a project fail just to prove a point.
Some people micromanage.
Some use weaponized sarcasm. The framework doesn't judge the tendency. It just requires that you isolate it and name it.
Because mapping these behavioral loops, literally writing down the cause and your specific ugly effect on a piece of paper, is the mandatory prerequisite to rewriting them.
You cannot replace a behavioral loop that you refuse to acknowledge exists.
This is where we integrate the concept of a 7-day schedule to master these skills.
Yeah.
Because you don't just read this on a Sunday and become a Zen master on Monday.
Cool, absolutely not. If we're designing a 7-day arc based on this text, days 1 and 2 are purely about baseline observation.
So just carrying this mental worksheet around.
Yeah, watching yourself fail, essentially, noting, there's my incompetence trigger and there's my tendency to micromanage. You are just gathering data.
And then by day 3 and 4.
You are actively mapping those loops on paper, writing out the when X happens, I tend to do Y formulas.
Which brings us to our focus today, day 5, the actual rewriting phase. The text introduces the art of the replacement response.
This is where the theoretical self-awareness translates into tangible, real-world leverage.
The framework provides a concrete workplace case study for this. It gives us the loop we just mentioned. When I feel triggered by people jumping to conclusions, I tend to become sharp and over-explain.
And then it provides the exact engineered replacement script.
Right. Let's slow down and look at what we know so far.
This script is a masterclass in behavioral engineering.
To me, designing this replacement response is exactly like drafting a fire escape plan for a skyscraper.
Right.
Think about the logic of a fire drill. You do not wait until the building is filling with thick black smoke, and the alarms are screaming to sit down at your desk and sketch out a blueprint for how to exit the building.
Because if you tried that, you would panic, you would succumb to the smoke, and you would perish.
Exactly. You design the fire escape plan when the building is perfectly safe, when your heart rate is resting, and when you have a clear analytical head.
You do the hard thinking in advance.
So that when the alarm sounds and your brain inevitably goes into fight or flight mode, you don't have to invent a solution. You just blindly, mechanically execute the plan you already memorized.
That is a phenomenal analogy because it perfectly aligns with the neurobiology we discussed earlier. When you are activated, when that disrespect trigger is smashed, your executive functioning literally powers down.
You do not have the cognitive resources or the vocabulary in that exact second to invent a diplomatic, constructive response.
If you try to wing it, you will default to your sledgehammer tendency. The replacement script is your prefabricated fire escape.
So let's deconstruct the linguistic brilliance of the specific script provided in the text. Let's slow down and look at what we know so far. Why does this specific arrangement of words work so effectively to de-escalate a room?
We have to look at how it specifically neutralizes the speaker's negative tendency. The stated tendency is becoming sharp and over-explaining.
And over-explaining is an inherently defensive posture.
Yes. It's a rapid-fire monologue born from the deep anxiety of not being heard or understood. It pushes people away, so the replacement script is engineered to do the exact opposite.
Instead of a defensive monologue, it initiates an inclusive collaboration.
Let's look at the first two words. Let's slow down.
Pay close attention to the word let's. It does not say, you need to slow down.
If you tell an activated, stressed person to calm down or slow down, it is like telling a drowning person to stop splashing.
It fundamentally misinterprets their panic as a deliberate choice, and it will only make them fight harder.
Exactly. Let's implies collective action. It says we are in this dynamic together. It instantly neutralizes the adversarial nature of the trigger.
It psychologically moves you from opposite sides of the battlefield to the same side of the table, looking at the problem together.
It removes the target from their chest, and then look at the second half of the script. And look at what we know so far.
This is the cognitive anchor.
Right. The trigger in this scenario is people jumping to conclusions, which is an anxiety-driven, assumption-based behavior. What is the antidote to emotional assumptions?
Objective data.
Exactly, objective data. By saying what we know so far, the script gently but firmly steers the entire conversation away from emotional speculation and grounds it back in verifiable facts.
It completely dismantles the trigger without ever attacking or shaming the person who triggered you.
It is absolute linguistic judo. It uses the momentum of the panic to guide the conversation into a safe space.
And the actionable takeaway for you right now is to build out your own customized scripts. As part of your 7-day mastery schedule, take your top 3 triggers and your 3 ugly tendencies.
Sit down with your morning coffee in a state of total calm and draft your fire escape plans. Engineer 3 calm, assertive replacement scripts that specifically neutralize your worst instincts.
And you will need them memorized because days 6 and 7 of the schedule are all about live deployment. The framework gives a very strict directive for this real-time practice. Each time you feel activated, pause, and silently name the trigger.
Okay, this is where it gets really tactical.
I have a major operational question about this step. I want to zero in on that specific adverb, silently. I know from basic psychology that naming emotions downregulates the amygdala, but why the strict rule about doing it silently in our own heads?
What's your instinct telling you to do instead?
Honestly, if I do the hard work of diagnosing the dynamic, my instinct as a peer is to communicate it to the room, to establish a clear boundary. I would say, hey, David, your approach to this project is really activating my lack of ownership trigger right now.
Oh, no.
If I know the boundary, why is stating it out loud a bad idea?
It is a terrible idea because calling it out weaponizes your self-awareness against your colleagues. You are turning your internal regulation tool into an external diagnostic weapon.
It comes across as incredibly arrogant and clinical, doesn't it?
Highly arrogant. The goal of this framework is your internal emotional regulation, not playing armchair therapist for your coworkers.
Fair point.
But more importantly, the mandate to name it silently is rooted in the deep mechanics of neurobiology. Silently naming creates a literal firewall in your brain.
Walk me through the biology of that. How does a silent thought build a firewall?
When you are activated, you are completely submerged in the emotion. From a subjective standpoint, you are the anger. You are the indignation.
The limbic system is running the show.
Totally. But the moment you force yourself to pause and silently articulate a complete sentence in your mind, like, this is the incompetence trigger, you are forcing electrical signals out of the limbic system.
And pushing them where?
Into the linguistic analytical centers of the prefrontal cortex. You are demanding that your brain process language and categorization.
You are literally rerouting blood flow away from the panic center and back into the logic center.
Precisely. By forcing your brain to search for the correct vocabulary word, is this incompetence or is this disrespect? You are forcing the rational engine to turn back on.
You immediately shift from being the helpless victim drowning in the emotional wave to being the active, rational observer standing on the shore watching the wave crash.
And this brings up a vital point about how we actually measure progress in this practice. Because a lot of people try this for a day, they still feel angry, and they assume the framework failed.
Right. They reflect on their daily emotional patterns and think, I was still mad at David, so I failed.
But the text does not say, progress is never feeling activated again. That is a biological impossibility. You are a human being. You will have triggers until the day you die.
So if the goal isn't achieving a state of permanent zen where nothing bothers me, how do we track our success? What does tangible progress look like when you sit down at the end of the day to reflect?
Success is measured exclusively by the speed of the sequence. It is measured by the contraction of that microgap we discussed at the top of the show.
The gap between activation and control.
Yes. How quickly can you execute the pause, silently name, deploy replacement script sequence before your negative tendency takes over?
So on day one of your tracking, you might not name the trigger until 3 hours after the tense meeting while you were driving home and gripping the steering wheel.
And that is still a massive victory. You mapped the loop.
By day 3, you might catch it 5 minutes after the interaction.
True mastery, the ultimate growth edge, is when the stimulus hits and within half a second, before you even draw breath to deliver a sarcastic reply, you silently name the trigger, intercept the tendency, and deploy your fire escape script.
It's just shrinking the gap. It's tightening the response time between smelling smoke and grabbing the fire extinguisher.
Exactly. It's a continuous daily reflection.
Now, as we get better at shrinking this gap, the framework issues a glaring red alert warning about a trap that almost everyone falls into during this exact microsecond.
The ultimate trap.
It says, watch for defending your intent too soon. And it arms us with one final, incredibly potent replacement script for this specific trap. I want to respond thoughtfully, not quickly.
Defending your intent too soon. This derails so many workplace interactions.
I have to play devil's advocate here because this goes against every single fiber of my being, and I think most people listening will agree.
Let's hear the defense.
If I say something in a meeting and someone completely misunderstands my intent, if they interpret my question as a malicious attack when I was genuinely just trying to clarify a data point, my visceral, overwhelming instinct is to clear my name immediately.
Of course it is.
I want to jump in and say, whoa, no, that's not what I meant at all. You're taking this the wrong way. Why is defending my pure intentions framed as a catastrophic trap?
Because in high-pressure, emotionally charged situations, immediate defense almost always achieves the exact opposite of what you intend. It backfires spectacularly.
Let's unpack the psychology of why.
When someone is upset with you, and your immediate reaction is to defend your intent, saying, I didn't mean it like that, or you're misunderstanding me, you are essentially telling that person that their emotional reality in that moment is invalid.
Oh, wow.
You are prioritizing your own reputation, your own comfort, and your own invisible intentions over the very real, visible distress they are experiencing.
That is a staggering way to frame it. By rushing to clear my name, I am basically saying my invisible, unprovable intent is vastly more important than the actual tangible impact my words just had on you.
Exactly. You are centering yourself in their moment of distress. Furthermore, defending yourself too quickly almost always registers neurologically to the other person as reactive, guilty, or highly dismissive.
It instantly escalates the tension.
Because you have just turned a moment of emotional expression into a courtroom debate about who is right and who is wrong.
And the other person feels unheard and invalidated.
So their natural response is to double down on their frustration and attack harder to make you understand their pain.
So the tragic irony here is that in my desperate attempt to put out the fire of their misunderstanding, I am actually the one pouring gasoline on the flames by invalidating them.
Yes, which is why the final replacement script provided by the framework is so crucial. I want to respond thoughtfully, not quickly.
Let's break down why this specific sentence is a masterclass in de-escalation and boundary setting. It's so good because it just slams the brakes on the entire runaway train.
It serves a brilliant dual purpose. First, it deeply flatters the situation and validates the other person.
How so?
By stating that you want to respond thoughtfully, you are acknowledging that their concern is weighty, it is valid, and it deserves serious, dedicated consideration.
You are providing emotional validation without conceding any factual agreement.
Right. You aren't saying they are right, you're saying they are important.
You are signaling your perspective is so significant that it requires the full capacity of my prefrontal cortex, not just a knee-jerk defensive reaction.
It satisfies their deep need to be taken seriously. And the second purpose of the script is purely for your own tactical protection.
It firmly seizes control of the pacing of the interaction.
Yes. When someone is upset with you, the biological instinct is to rush, to talk fast, to fix it immediately, to alleviate the awkwardness.
This script completely rejects that timeline.
It draws a line in the sand and declares, I will not be forced into a rushed, emotionally compromised reaction by your urgency.
It buys you the critical seconds or even minutes you need to execute your pause and silently name sequence. It is the ultimate boundary-setting statement disguised as a compliment.
Exactly. It's an incredibly powerful tool to have in your arsenal.
So, as we look to wrap up this analysis, let's synthesize the journey we've just mapped out for you. We started by challenging the conventional, exhausted wisdom of corporate communication.
We moved away from the superficial, exhausting philosophy of just managing our tone.
Painting over the water leak.
Right. And committed to the deep structural work of managing our triggers.
We recognized the 5 deep evolutionary roots of reactivity that live inside all of us: unfairness, incompetence, wasted time, disrespect, and lack of ownership.
We learned that when we react poorly, it is never just about the moment. It is because one of these primitive survival roots has been disturbed.
We took on the highly uncomfortable task of mapping our own toxic loops using that brutally honest formula. When I feel triggered by X, I tend to Y.
And from that awareness, we learned how to architect our fire escape plans.
The pre-written replacement responses that neutralize our worst instincts and steer the conflict toward collaborative data.
We explored the neurobiological power of the silent name, how pausing to silently label the trigger forces blood flow away from the emotional center and puts the rational pilot back in the seat.
And finally, we armed ourselves against the ultimate trap of defending our intent too quickly, learning to use validation as a tool to buy time and control the pace of the conflict. I want to respond thoughtfully, not quickly.
It is a remarkably comprehensive framework. But as a final reminder to you, the listener, integrating this is not a one-and-done solution.
You cannot just listen to this breakdown and expect to be immune to office politics tomorrow.
No, it is a daily, rigorous practice. The goal is not perfection. You will still get triggered. You will still occasionally deploy your negative sledgehammer tendency.
The goal is simply awareness. It is recognizing that growth edge, that micro gap between activation and control, and fighting to find it a fraction of a second sooner each time.
It's about building the neurological muscle memory so that the replacement response eventually becomes your new default setting.
And as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Something to just let simmer in the back of your mind as you go about your week, inevitably encountering incompetence, disrespect, and wasted time.
The text we analyzed today, this incredibly dense, psychologically demanding blueprint for emotional regulation, it is specifically labeled as Day 5 of the Mastery of the Internal Response Protocol.
Day 5.
Yes.
If this level of profound emotional deconstruction, this ruthless admission of our own toxic tendencies, and this silent, real-time biological trigger naming is only Day 5, what deeply held foundational beliefs about yourself did you have to dismantle on days 1 through 4 just to be ready to survive today?